Good morning, folks. Dr. Charlie Hall again with you, and welcome to today's webinar. Appreciate you being with us today. And of course, the title of today's webinar is Results of the TNLA Economic Impact / Scope Report. And some of you may recall that for many, many years we published a scope report as part of the TNLA activities. And now we've combined that with an economic impact assessment, and we have Dr. Marco Palma on the line with us to discuss that. So just a few logistics, as if you'll remember, in terms of the webinar software. This is kind of, you have an open window and you've got a control panel which looks like this over here. And the way that control panel works is that you've got an orange button there which you can click on and open and close your panel if it's in the way. And then you've got also some viewing options. You can view the presentation full screen by just clicking on view and selecting it. Now if you happen to have microphone and speakers, you won't be able to use your microphone today. I have everybody muted. But you can listen to the webinar through your speakers. And if you wanted to use your telephone, if you're having some difficulty, you could do that. Just go into audio setup and select telephone, and it gives you an audio pin that you have to plug in after you dial the phone number. If you have questions today, then there's a question box that's at the bottom of that control panel, and that's where you'll type your questions, and we'll be addressing those questions at the end, and we're saving some time for that. And so feel free to ask anything, it's wide open and so forth, but that's where you'll do that. Now also at the very end, when we close out, you'll be taken to an area where you can fill out a very short evaluation survey. And this particular webinar is co-sponsored by both TNLA, the Texas Nursery and Landscape Association, as well as the Southern Region Risk Management Education Center. And so it's very important in terms of getting the grant dollars to help offset the cost of providing these webinars, that we provide some evaluations of these webinars. So your help there is much appreciated. And as usual, we are recording this particular webinar. And those recordings are on the Ellison Chair website, and you'll be receiving an email after the fact with a link to the recorded session. Now today's speaker is Dr. Marco Palma, and Marco is a great friend of mine and a very talented agricultural economist in the Department of Agricultural Economics. He's an associate professor and extension economist in the department here, and of course his expertise is manyfold. Not only does he talk about marketing, but overall structure, conduct, performance of the industry. And Marco's also the one that takes the lead in generating the economic contributions report that has supplanted the old scope report. So with that, Marco, I'm going to change the presenter rights over to you, and I'll let you get started on today's webinar.
Thank you, my friend. It is really a pleasure for me to have the time today to talk to you a little bit about the economic state of the industry here in Texas. And I'm especially glad to talk to you about the numbers because we have seen a little bit of improvement over the last year in terms of sales for the industry. And what I want to do today is I want to start talking a little bit about the background information of how we collect the data. And essentially, for many years, we did a scope report, and a few years ago, we started doing the economic impact or economic contributions report. But there was a slight confusion among some of the readers, and the main outlet that we distribute these results is the green industry, the TNLA's green magazine. And some readers were a little bit confused because we put one report out, which was first the scope report, essentially sales, and then the following month we had the economic impact report, and the numbers were somewhat similar. And there was some confusion to why we have one sales report that says one thing, but on the other hand, we have another report that is supposed to be economic impacts, but has similar numbers. So hopefully we're trying to avoid that confusion and do a better explanation of how are the two linked together. And that's what I'm going to try to do in this presentation, is to see that relationship between sales and economic impacts. And in collecting the data, we have switched from the old standard industry classification codes to the North American industry classification codes. And the main difference is that we have a lot more sectors in the NAICS system representing different industry. And the green industry is not an exception. We have a much more detail into what sectors go for the green industry in terms of production and manufacturing, horticultural services, and wholesale and retail trade. So that puts us in a situation where we're able to gather more information and do a better report that has a comprehensive view of the overall industry, including all of the sectors. Now, one of the challenges that we face is that we no longer have any data from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, which used to put a report together every year for the nursery and greenhouse sector. And so we have to change that baseline information as often as we can. And we have changed the baseline data for this report this year. And I'm going to discuss briefly how is that changed and what does that mean. But essentially, the only sector that we have a baseline that we estimate from is the nursery and greenhouse. The reason we do that, as some of you may know, is because all other sectors have to report their taxed information, and that's the data we use to estimate sales. But in terms of the greenhouse and nursery, we have some underreporting because at the grower level, we have some issues in terms of what needs to be reported, and so we actually have to use that baseline information. Then I'm going to go and look at sales, and we're going to do that by sector, essentially the growers, landscapers, and retailing. And then I'm going to give some information about sales by major metropolitan statistical areas in the states. One of the things that I've been trying to do in the last couple of years is we've also been trying to get some information about county level sales. And one of the main issues with county level data is that there might be some counties where there are only 2, 3, or maybe 4 firms that are reporting sales, and then we do not get that information because that might mean that if we were to get that information, we will have a specific information about a specific firms. So when we look at county level data, we have to do an estimation based on the overall level and some historical data. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that information and feed it into an in-plan model, which is essentially an input-output model that looks at sales, how do those relate to the overall economy. And then we can come up with estimates of economic contributions in terms of sales, in terms of employment and the number of jobs generated, and also in terms of value added for the green industry. And then once I finish that, I want to look, well, what's ahead? What should we look for in 2012 and beyond? Remember that we get this data information from the Texas Comptroller's Office, and it's usually about a year lag. So all of the numbers that we're going to be presenting today are numbers for sales for the year 2011. So with that being said, we have combined, as I mentioned before, the scope and the economic impact reports, and we do that in 3 main sectors. The first one is the production and manufacturing sector, which essentially is composed of nursery and greenhouse, lawn and garden equipment manufacturing, and prefabricated metal buildings. Then we have the horticultural services, which is mainly the landscaping sector, both landscaping services and landscape architectural services. And then we have the retail sector. Now, there is an important distinction between sales and economic impact. And this is especially true when we look at these 3 sectors, for example. If we look at sales, most of the products that we sell at the retail level are products that are coming from production and manufacturing. So if we look at total sales for the retail industry, we might think and say, well, in a way, we're actually double counting those products because we already accounted for those products sales in the production and manufacturing. So what we've done this year is that we've done the retail gross sales, which is just the total, and then we've estimated what is the actual portion of those sales that correspond to the retail sector alone. And that's what we report now as net sales in retail. So that's the key differentiation when we look at sales and economic impacts. When we take the sales that pertain only to those sectors. So if you look at production and manufacturing and horticultural services, we use the overall number for sales to estimate economic impacts. When it comes to retail, we only use the net sales. So that's when you will see an important distinction. And that was the main confusion that we had in previous reports in terms of what's the difference between economic impact and sales. Now, it's also very important because the main benefit of this project is that we can go back as an industry and say, this is our story. And this is who we are. This is the impact that we have in the Texas economy. This is the number of jobs that we created last year. And it was difficult for people to know, well, which report am I supposed to use? Well, now we have one place to go, and we have consolidated into one single report. So anybody who wants to take a look at it can go and find the information in one single place. Now, the new thing that we also have is that we've added county sale estimates. As I mentioned, the main challenge in doing that is that for some counties, there might only be one or two firms, so we do not get disclosure on that data. But sometimes these firms are so large that we lose a lot of that data doing county estimates. So we have to rely on some sort of an estimate to come up with those sale figures. And I'll show you that here in a minute. But in terms of the NAICS Codes, which is essentially how we get the data from the Texas Comptroller's Office, all business establishments belong to a specific North American Industry Classification Code. And they have to report sales every year for every code. And so these sales numbers are updated and revised every 3 years. So if we go back, sometimes you will look at last year reports, and you can look at the 2010 and 2009 numbers, and you might see that they change a little bit. Well, the reason they change a little bit is because the Comptroller's Office do some revision to those numbers, and those numbers are not final until after 3 years. So if you look at the numbers 4 years ago, you will see that they're exactly the same. But then the numbers for the last couple of years, they might change a little bit as the Texas Comptroller's Office revise that information. And the only place where we do an estimate based on a baseline is for the nursery and landscaping sector, which is NAICS Code 1114. Any other sector that we do in this report, it's the actual sales numbers that come directly from the Texas Comptroller's Office. What does that mean? Well, if we look at the codes that pertain to the green industry, these are the main codes. So we look at the nursery and greenhouse, lawn and garden equipment manufacturing, and then greenhouse manufacturing. Those are the production and manufacturing sectors. Then we have the landscaping sectors, and then we have the retail sectors going from flower, nursery, stock, and florist supplies, wholesalers, all the way to farm and garden machinery. Now, you will know that there's a star next to some of these codes, and that's because some of those codes are not only representing sales to the green industry, but rather they have a more general code. So we have to account for what is the actual portion that it's green industry related, and we have those estimates based on the data that we get. We can actually get an estimate of what is the green industry portion of those by going and looking at some sub codes for that specific NAICS. So the baseline data that we use, that we actually changed it this year, is the National Nursery Survey. And some of you might be familiar with this. We actually had a webinar a few months ago where myself and Charlie and Alan Hodges from Florida presented some information. But in terms of just a little bit of background of how we changed the data to be the baseline for this year's, we have conducted prior to the one that we're using the baseline for this year, we had conducted 4 national surveys in 1989, 93, 2008, and 2004. The point I want to make here is that the data we were using from the USDA had 36 states, but then they went down to only do 15 states because of funding reasons. Now, the baseline that we're now using was the 2009 National Nursery Survey, and this had information for the first time in all 50 states in the U.S. And it incorporated questions about sales, employment, production and marketing practices, regional trade, and other influencing factors in terms of business decision and pricing decisions. So we had a list of about 38,000 businesses, and we did a stratified random sample with a mail portion and also an email sample in 12 different states. The result of that is the most comprehensive green industry sales report that we had to date. And if you're interested, that was part of another webinar, but if you're interested in looking and comparing yourself related to other businesses in the state of Texas or related to other businesses nationally in terms of what are the important factors, what are some of the advertising activities they do, what are some of the production practices, including IPM practices, you can take a look at that full report. And you can get that at the website greenindustryresearch.org, and then you can look at the overall economic impact. Now, those are sales for 2008. So what we've done is actually construct that baseline for 2008 and use the Texas Controller's data to adjust for that baseline and bring those numbers to current numbers in 2011. So when doing that, what we see is, and I have this a table here where I report sales, and I also have the number of establishments. And what we see is that the numbers of establishments in general has either remained constant or decreased a little bit in all sectors. But what we see is that production and manufacturing went up to a record high of $1.9 billion. That is the highest level that we have ever recorded in Texas history. Now, one point I want to make is that when you look at nursery and greenhouse, well, there wasn't much of a big change from last year. The majority of the increase in production and manufacturing actually came from the lawn and garden equipment manufacturing, which, as we pointed out in our last report, we have seen more people switching into do-it-yourself type of operations rather than hiring contracting services for the landscaping sector. So as we see that switch, we see an increase in the purchase of equipment, but we see a reduction in the landscaping sector. Last year we had a very small reduction in terms of sales. That numbers have been adjusted a little bit, and now we see that the horticultural services sector has total sales of about a little bit more than $3.5 billion. Now, when we look at wholesale and retail trade, these are the gross sales number, which are about $10.1 billion. And again, when we look at this, some of these products have already been accounted for in the other sectors. So what we need to do is we need to account for the portion that is only at the retail level. And when we do that, we distinguish between net sales and gross sales. But overall, if you look at total sales, if you want to be able to compare to previous reports and see how the industry is doing, we are estimating a total of $15.59 billion for total sales in the state for 2011, which is higher than any other value that we've done before. Now, if you were to transform those numbers, and you look at here at the 2011 numbers, if we want to transform those retail figures into a net value, what we found is that those $10.1 billion actually represent about $3.8 billion of net sales to the retail industry. So this is the main difference between the sales report and the economic impact report. So when we do the economic impact estimations, we will take the grower sales number, the landscaping sales numbers, but then we will take the retail net sales numbers to estimate the economic contributions. And then what we can see here, we can see what has happened to the grower sector for the past 6 years or so, and the same for the other sectors. If we were to look at this graphically, we can see that the recession had a very high impact in grower sales. And we had the lowest levels of the past few years in 2009 as the worst part of the recession in March of 2009. Then we had a little bit of an increase in 2010, and now we have an important increase. If you look at total sales, the grower sector was the one that experienced the highest growth with almost 20% of growth. Now, most of that growth was actually, as I mentioned before, in the lawn garden equipment manufacturing as people were switching to more do-it-yourself type of operations. The landscaping sector had a slight increase of only about 3% in 2011. And total sales are 3.5, but we can see for the past 3 years, we went down from the 2008 levels, and now if you look at that trend, it's almost flat. And we haven't really seen an increase. Part of that is because the landscaping sector is linked a lot to the housing market and the new housing starts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation when I talk about what's ahead and what are some of the projections for this year and next year and some of the years to come. In terms of retail sales, we have seen a steady increase. 2001 was an important year where we saw a little bit more of consumer confidence, and we saw more spending at retail level in general, and that was also the case for green industry products. And in total, we see an important increase in sales to about 10.1 billion. That represents about 3.8 billion in net sales. So total sales overall look well. We have experienced an increase of about 8% overall if we look at across all 3 sectors of green industry, and that's the good news that we had. Now, if we look at what's happened in terms of comparing overall sales with sales in the major metropolitan statistical areas, there are about 20-something major metropolitan statistical areas. But for the green industry, we have divided those into 5 different areas. And what we can see here is that Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin represent almost 56% of total sales in the green industry, with Houston being about a third of that, Dallas being almost another third, and then San Antonio 12%, Fort Worth close to 12%, and then Austin about 10% of that portion of sales. Now, the other thing that we've done this year, and we've been doing this for a couple of years, is that we are using GIS mapping technology to look at what are some of the estimates for county sales. And as you look at this, we have divided those sales into each one of those sectors. And what you can see here is that there is a very direct relationship between population areas and sales, especially as it relates to landscaping and total sales. But what you can see here, so the darker the color, the more sales for those specific counties. And we've done those maps to show those. And we also have a table, which I'm not going to present here, but it's going to be available in the full report when it comes out with the estimates for sales for each county. If you look at the landscaping sales, there is a wide distribution of services because that includes both landscaping services and landscaping installation and architectural services. But again, you can see the relationship between sales and some of the major metropolitan statistical areas. In terms of retailing, you can see that clear picture, and again, you can see that it's linked to the major areas of population growth in the state. Total sales by county are also estimated, and you will have access. It is my understanding that TNLA will put out the report, the full report, and in the January issue of TNLA Green Magazine, so you will be able to get a copy of all of these information. Now, we have looked at sales. What about economic impacts of the industry? And when we estimate those, what we see is that when we look at production, that's almost $3.7 billion of total economic contributions in terms of sales. So we use the sales numbers to calculate a multiplier and say, well, how much of that is the actual value to the Texas economy. And when we think about this, think about it in terms of, well, green industry products, we sell green industry products, but then we employ a lot of people who in turn are going to go back and spend and stimulate the economy. They're going to go and buy cars and buy clothing and buy food and other goods, and then they will stimulate other sectors, not just the green industry sector. So in that term, we have output sales. What are the measures that those sales are contributing to the economy, both in terms of direct effects to the green industry alone, but also induced effects to other industries. And then we have also the number of jobs created by each one of these sectors, and of course we have the value added. So if you look at horticultural services, it's about $7.5 billion. So for these two sectors, what we can see is that there is almost a 2.0 economic multiplier, which means that if we look at sales for the production and manufacturing, they were about $1.9 billion, and the economic contributions are almost twice as much, because that multiplier is almost 2. The same is true for the horticultural services. That multiplier is almost 2, and we had sales of about $3.5 billion. When we look at the total economic contributions, that's almost $7.6 billion. The key difference here is that when we look at the wholesale and retail trade, we use the sales number for the net sales. So rather than using the $10 billion, we're using the figure for 3.8 billion to estimate wholesale and retail economic contributions. But you can see that differentiation. Now, what about jobs creation? And when we look at this, and this administration has been very vocal about job creation, and that's, to me, very important as we move forward in the industry in terms of trying to generate more sales and overall increase in the industry. What we see is that we estimated about 32,000 jobs in the production and manufacturing sector, about 88,000 jobs in the horticultural services, and about 80,000 jobs in the wholesale and retail sector. So overall, if we put all of those together, there are over 200,000 jobs created, and those are full-time equivalent jobs created by the green industry in the state of Texas alone. So that's a very big number in terms of jobs created. If we look at individual sectors, and you can see the distinction here in this table, not only in terms of production and manufacturing, but you can also see each one of those sectors and how many jobs they contributed to the Texas economy. Once again, for those sectors who green industry represents a portion, there was an estimation of those sales and those economic contributions, and also in terms of employment. Now, value added is specifically, if we take those products, what was the value added for those in terms of economic contributions? And we can see that the total value added for all three sectors was about $10.7 billion. Now, when looking at economic contributions by the major metropolitan statistical areas, what we can see is we have that division there. Austin generates about $1 billion in terms of output, which generates almost 12,000 jobs. Dallas is $3.1 billion with 35,000 jobs. Fort Worth about 1.1, 13,000 jobs. San Antonio is 1.2 with 13,000 jobs. Houston 3.4 billion in economic contributions with 38,000 jobs. And the other metropolitan areas represent almost $8 billion in economic contributions and 88,000 jobs. So overall, over 200,000 jobs and almost $18 billion in economic contributions. So we are a very big industry, and we provide a lot of in terms of the economy in Texas. Now, when we look at these numbers, one of the things that we can use these numbers for, and that we've effectively done so in the past, is that we can go back to the legislature, we can go back to the industry and other groups, and we can tell our story and how important we are. And we might not see the individual benefits of having this type of information, but I think that TNLA has been very proactive in being able to maintain and keep this information, and we are the only state in the country who has a system where we have a yearly information about sales. So to me, it's very important for us to know where should we go. The first question we need to answer is where we are at today, and so we can plan in the future and see how important the industry is. And when we look at that, what does that mean in terms of all the numbers that we talked about, and what are some of the things to look ahead? Well, what I did is essentially, this is a very simple regression model, but what I wanted to do is, look at this and say, well, what's the major contributor of green industry sales? And I thought that maybe the main contributor is per capita income. That's what's really driving sales for the green industry. So I developed these very simple regression model, which accounts for about 96% of the variation in green industry sales are due to income. That's what that R-squared number means there. And we can see it's a very statistically significant model. And I don't really, I just wanted to show you what that means. But we have data here specifically for Texas from 1984 to 2011. And what we found is that if we look at that relationship, it's very important in terms of per capita income. And per capita income explains about 96.7% of the variation in green industry sales. So what should we expect? Well, what we have one issue now is in terms of the economy and generating jobs. What are the two things that affect per capita income? Well, first is overall gross domestic production, but then also population. So as we move along, what happens is that we are growing our economy, but not as fast as we could be looking at increase. So when you divide that by the increase in number of people, that per capita income is becoming relatively less than what it was in the past. So that's where we saw those levels in 2009 and 2010 that were not as high in terms of green industry sales. So if we are to expect an increase in green industry sales, we need to see an increase at the household level income on a per capita basis. Another important thing to look at is consumer confidence index. And this consumer confidence index is actually current up until October the 12th, 2012. So just about 10 days ago, I went and looked at that. And if you look at this graph, we have come a long way from March 2009, which is the lowest point that you can see there. But then we had an increasing trend overall. And then when you can see that big dip going down again in the middle of 2011, almost 2012, was when there were some talks what happened in Europe, and that there was some fear here domestically that we might go into a double dip recession. So that's when there were some fears, but overall we can see an increasing trend, and we have seen that increase in terms of retail sales. Now the problem in this equation is that when we look at job generation and we look at trying to increase the economy and we look about job creation, the problem is that we have over 20 million people without a job, and that's only accounting for those who have been looking for a job and not outside of the labor force for more than 6 months. If we were to account for those, we're probably looking at an unemployment rate of close to about 10%, maybe even higher than that. So when we look at job creation, one of the issues that I just see, and it's just very simple that I want to point this out to you, is that in addition to the people who are currently unemployed, if we go back about 18 or 20 years, that means that we have, so we go back to about 1990. If you look at that year, we had over 2.5 million people that were born that year, which means that we will have 2.5 additional people in the workforce this year. So essentially, in order for us just to keep up the same level of unemployment, we need to generate at least 2.5 million jobs. That's just to keep up with population growth. Now, if we go back to the highest job creation levels that we had in the last 20-something years, which was in the period of 2000 to 2003, that means that if we go to that high level of job creation, it will still take us about 10 years or more to be able to generate enough jobs to recover the economy in terms of generating jobs. So we are a long way from that level. And again, that's assuming that we generate jobs at the highest levels that we had in the past 20-something years. So we have seen some very good economic indicators, but the problem, what bothers me about it, and it seems so artificial, is the fact that we haven't been able to generate enough jobs. And our industry is a little different in that sense compared to other industries like fruits and vegetables and other food products that are viewed by consumers as more inelastic. In other words, people have to eat and they have to buy those products. Our sales are tied very highly to per capita income, as we've shown in the past slide. So the success of the industry in terms of generating growth will be dependent upon how well we grow as an economy, how well we recover from the job market, and also what I want to point out is that what we've done and what we've seen so far is that the number of firms, if you look at the number of firms in the U.S., about half of the firms sell $250,000 or less, but those firms only represent almost 1.2% of total sales in the industry. So we have a lot of small firms, and when you look at those, there are estimates as high as 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of those firms are already out of business. So the question here is, how is the picture for the overall health of the industry? And it's not very promising. Fortunately, we have seen an increase in retail sales, which is driving some of the production. And we've also seen a switch going from more do-it-yourself type of operations, which increases a little bit of demand in the grower side. And we have fared a lot better here in Texas than in other states. But we need to continue to see some growth in the industry. And the good news is that we have a positive growth for the past year, and we are forecasting that this next year in 2012 we'll probably continue to see some growth in all sectors of the grain industry. So with that, I would like to open the floor for some questions.
Yeah, very good, Marco. We do have a... Sorry about that. I didn't mean to cut you off there, Marco.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we got a couple of questions. One of those, when you were talking about some of the uses of this data in terms of with our state legislature, one person is asking what types of issues could be addressed with this type of data.
Sure. And you know, there is a wide range variety of issues. And if you look at the industry, for example, those issues might range from things related to immigration and labor. One of the issues that we had in the past is labor, not only in terms of the price of labor, but also availability. And even with very high levels of wages, we haven't, in some cases, been able to obtain reliable labor in some part of the state. And even outside of the state, it's the same type of story. So if we can show our story in terms of employment generation and in terms of what we need to in the industry, I think that's very important. But it's not only related to that. It's also related, for example, to water use. It's a whole wide range of things that we are able to show how big of an industry, of an impact we may have, and that helps overall the industry, for the industry overall, but also helps in terms of the legislature to recognize some of the issues in terms of the number of jobs created.
Exactly, and I think any issue that could potentially negatively impact the industry, this type of data will be very useful in combating those issues. And you know, you've already mentioned immigration, water, healthcare reform. I mean, all those topics are critically important to our industry, And so unless you can as an association, unless you as individual participants in the industry can use this information to inform legislators, then you have no recourse but to accept what comes down the pike. So you got to show the impact in terms of jobs and the impact in terms of sales of these types of legislative issues. So I've got another question here, Marco, that says, when you were using per capita income in your regression, was that Texas income or U.S. income data?
That's a very good question, and I used U.S. income. The reason I used U.S. income is it's basically because of two reasons. There is not much difference if you look statistically at the overall picture of per capita income in Texas versus the national level. There is some slight difference, but if you look at the overall trend, is very similar. And the other reason is because we have a big portion of sales that go outside of the state of Texas. So when I look at that picture and I look at sales, those are not occurring only in the state of Texas, but are going nationally to many other states. And in that regard, the green industry sales in the state are a function not only of per capita income in the state, but also per capita income nationally. That's a very good question.
And another question is consumer confidence. And actually they refer to me in this question. So we've heard Charlie talk about the lack of correlation between consumer confidence and sales. Did you include a regression to prove that?
I did not, and mainly the way this statistic is calculated, it is essentially asking people how they feel about spending money, and in general they put this survey out and they ask people, if you were to face these two situations, for example, are you planning on spending any significant amount of money in durable goods in the next few weeks? Do you prefer to hold some of those, the money that you have in your savings account? So they actually use these questions to see where are people trying to hold on more to their money and to generate more savings as opposed to spending more of that money. Yeah. But when you look at that, usually what happens is that there is a lag effect in terms of when people say something about what they're going to do, and the lag effect meaning that those actions that they're reporting they will make usually are not done instantaneously. So there is a lag effect, and we do not see that reaction immediately, but rather it takes a few weeks, maybe even several months to look at a change in that. And the other thing is that people might, a big part of my area of research is looking at the difference between stated and revealed preference, which essentially means what people say they're going to do is sometimes very different than what they actually do. Especially when there is a survey like this, some people might perceive that it is better or it's preferred that they show they're saving some money, and they might not be able to report financially sensitive information. But I think it's better than having no information at all. Yes. So the consumer sentiment is simply saying, how good do I feel about go out and spending money? So there might not be a perfect correlation, but it's the best sort of information that we have out there to gauge and measure what we might expect in terms of retail sales and spending.
And that's there's always a discrepancy between those particular indicators. And I think what they're referring to is the fact that I've shown real personal consumption expenditures in the past in a graph, and it shows that we're spending more today than what we were prior to the recession. And yet if you look at consumer confidence, that indicator goes up and down and up and down and up and down depending on what media news release has been released for that day. So we're a fickle group, and we like things to be consistent, and that's just not been the case over the last 4 years. Okay, so we got a couple more questions. I'm going to combine a couple of questions into one. You talked about the landscaping sector growth has been flat, and that the also that in this other question it says the outlook is not too bright. Can you expound on that and give us a better sense of the outlook for the next 2, 4, or 6 years, particularly in terms of the landscape sector?
Sure. When we look at the landscaping sector, uh, one of the main drivers of the landscaping industry, and we look at those two sales number, are landscaping services and landscaping architectural services. So there are two main components in the demand equation for landscaping sales. One is that it's very tied to new housing starts and to the housing market. And we haven't really seen a lot of increase. We're starting to see some increase in certain states, especially here in Texas, of new housing starts. But the recovery for the housing market has not been as big as expected in the last couple of years. So that's the one thing that there's a very high correlation between the number of housing starts and the landscaping sector.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, you have on the demand side that people during recessionary or difficult periods, they tend to spend less money, which means that they try to save some of the money by doing some of the things themselves. So if you look at the real amount of income, and if you look at the inflation levels that we've had in the past, pretty much people are making less money today than they were making 2, 3, 4 years ago as a result of the recession, which means that they're constantly looking for ways to save money in certain type of products. And one of the ways that they've been switching to do that is they've been switching from landscaping contracting services to more do-it-yourself type of operations. So they've gone out and spent some money in equipment, and we saw a very huge increase in the lawn garden equipment manufacturing sector from the 2010 to 2011. But then that means that we also are seeing that the sales for the landscaping industry are relatively flat, which is reflecting that change overall. So we're looking at the demand side. What we see is that there are many factors that are lining up for people to switch, to make that switch. Part of the problem is that once these households have invested in their equipment, it's very unlikely that in the short term they will go back to contracting services, especially if they've gone out and spent an extra $1,000 for equipment. One of the things that we might look in terms of these is if we look at the size of the firms. So most of the firms in the industry are relatively small firms, and that means that there might be some competitive strategies that might be used. And we've been talking about this for many, many years. But as you go forward in next year, I think that one of the main things that we tend to do in the industry when there is a recessionary or a slowdown period, or maybe a period where we don't experience a lot of growth, is that we tend to reduce the budget in marketing and advertising. And I've always said that we need to actually increase it, because if somebody's looking for services and you have a lot of options, this is the time when you need to differentiate yourself from the rest and be able to tell why the services and the products that you're providing are different. But not only that, but make it easy for people to find you and make it easy for people to see the value of the services and products that you provide.
Exactly. Last question, then we'll call it a day, is when is your next economic report coming out? And of course, we mentioned that the Texas version is just released, right?
Well, yes, this will come out in the January issue of TNLA magazine, and then they will actually post that full report in the TNLA website. And so look for that probably in January. And,
right.
And the idea is that we will keep updating these numbers around the same time of the year. So we will expect to have some updating of the numbers about in October of next year, and then the new report will be released in January of the following year.
Right. And then, of course, if you look at on this slide here, we've got the National Nursery Survey that Marco alluded to earlier. We'll be doing that survey, updating it next year based off of this year's data, and then we'll be using that information to update the Green Industry Economic Contributions Report for the entire United States after that. But right now, both of those reports are on the greenindustryresearch.org website that you see there. And then last but not least, Marco, there's fantastic information. That's all the questions that we got today. You did a great job in summarizing a lot of stuff in a short period of time. So if you have friends that are out there that or other folks within your organization that missed today for some reason, the recording of this webinar will be on the Ellison Chair website. You see the URL there, and I don't have it linked because we're not through recording yet, but as soon as that recording is available, I'll be linking it to this particular line item within the Ellison Chair webpage. And if you happen to miss some of the ones that we've had before, those are also archived on the website, so you can click on those and you can see those previous webinars. So Marco, thank you again very much. Thank you, audience, for being here. And again, once I close out the session, you'll be taken to an evaluation page. Please help us out in terms of filling out that very short evaluation, because it does make a difference to our granting agency, the Southern Region Risk Management Education Center, to show the impacts. And of course, Chelsea over at TNLA always likes to see the evaluations of the webinars that they also help co-sponsor. So thank you all again very much, and we'll talk to you later.